please welcome our very own member, Dave Lieber.
A rooster. That's a really good way to describe him. Well, I hope I'm in the right room. My name is Thomas J. Henry, and I'm looking for clients. Am I in the right room? Okay. Yeah, I'm sick of the guy too. But he's paying my salary, it seems, right? So yeah, I've been a member of the Grapevine Historical Society since the fall of '93. So that's, 28, 29 years. And I remember there were these two wonderful ladies, Marion Brecken and Mary Virginia Simmons, who said to me, "You've never been to Grapevine Springs?" And I go, "No, I don't even know what that is." And they said, "Come on, follow us." They got in the car, they drove out to Cabela, and they showed me where the treaty was signed, right? So that's how my beginning was. Now, let's move this guy up a little bit here. He doesn't like to play second fiddle to anybody. So when I last left you a few months back, I talked to you about the Eamon Carter play and the Eamon Carter book, and he died in 1955. So now let's pick it up with Ross Perot. Okay, it's 1957, and he and Margot, his bride, are in their Plymouth car, and they're driving from Texarkana, where Ross grew up, and they have everything that they own is in the back seat and the trunk of their Plymouth car. They have nothing. They're starting fresh. He's going to a job in Dallas at IBM. And so when Ross gets to his apartment complex, he says to the landlord, "You know, my dad taught me 3 rules of life: negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. So I want to negotiate my rent with you, sir." And so the man said, "Well, I do need a handyman, a landscaper, and a property manager who lives on site, takes care of things. And if you do that, I'll drop your rent down to $95 a month." So Ross took the deal, which is kind of weird because if you think about it, if you lived in that apartment complex in 1957, 58, and your toilet broke, this guy was going to come and knock on your door and fix it, you know? Which I really can't get over that. But, you know, he didn't know what he wanted to be yet as a young man working at IBM because he had not invented it yet. But he was happy in that little apartment. They had 1 car. That's all they could afford, and Margot would, drop him off at work and keep the car the rest of the day, and she'd pick him up at night. And he would come whistling at home in the foyer of his house, happy to be home after work. He'd grab his kids, and he'd tell them he loved them. He'd say a prayer with them at night. He'd tell them, he'd kiss them goodnight, and then he'd say their phrase, the family slogan, "Buddies to the end." Buddies to the end. That's the Perot family slogan. So my contact with him really was through Junior, covering Alliance for the Star-Telegram. And I remember one time I wrote a column in 94, 95 with this throwaway line that said, "Boy, I'd like to ride with Ross Perot Jr. in his helicopter." You know, because Ross had the world's record for riding a helicopter around the world. Junior did. He did it in 29 days, all around the globe. And he used to fly the executives over Alliance and show them, this is where you can build your factory. So I basically just wrote that in the paper, and then a few weeks later, his secretary called and said, "Ross would like to take you flying." So I'm excited. I go to the place where the helipad is, and I'm waiting. Ross Jr. falls out of the sky, puts me on there with my headset. Now I can talk to him. I only remember 3 things from this ride. First is that I was making a lot of jokes, wisecracks, to try and break the ice. He didn't laugh at a single thing I said. He did not think I was funny at all. The second thing I said was, "Let me show you my house in Perotville." Because I had bought a house in his first master plan community. Junior's now built 80 of them. But I bought what I called Perotville because I thought it'd be funny to live in Perotville, write about it in the newspaper. And he snapped at me. He said, "It's not Perotville. It's Park Glen. Don't call it that." I said, "Okay, fine, that's right. There's my house. Check it out. See, I invested in you, Mr. Perot." And the third thing I remember from him is he said something really, really cool. I said to him, "What's it like to be the son of a presidential candidate who's worth billions of dollars?" And his answer was, "I saw the American dream unfold in my living room," which is really what happened. So it was only when I began to work on this project that I began to learn something about him that I never knew about him before, which was this man was so creative that he made his money 5 different ways. Most billionaires only make their money 1 or 2 ways. But the thing about it is, if he were here right now, he'd be mad at me. He'd cut me off. He'd say, "Button it up." That was one of his favorite expressions. He'd say, "Button it up. we don't want to hear about my money. He said, this isn't a story about money. And I'd say, Mr. Perot, indulge me. Let me just go over this real quick because it just shows one part of you. He took $1,000, and he turned it into what now is considered $8.5 billion. And I'll be able to draw the link between here, what's going on in Alliance today, with him being in that car in 1957, because that's really when Alliance began, in my opinion. The first way he made money was when he put EDS, Electronic Data Systems, his company, his landmark company, on the stock market. And pretty much overnight, he made $230 million. And Forbes magazine called him the fastest, richest Texan ever. Then he sold EDS to General Motors for $2.5 billion. So that's when he changed from a millionaire to a billionaire. And then things didn't work out at GM. We'll talk about that. He got a buyout in the mid-1980s for $750 million, which is got to be a record for a golden parachute. And then he and his son started Perot Systems, which they sold to Dell for $4 billion. And so the fifth way, of course, is Alliance, Texas, which, if you haven't been out there lately, it's just covered with warehouses, 500 companies. It's just really remarkable. But now he'd be yelling at me. He'd say, son, this is not a story about money. I'd say, what is it, Mr. Perot? And he would say, this is a story about family, about values, about honor, about keeping things in the family and teaching your children and your grandchildren traditions. He said, that's what I want you to emphasize. And I would say to him, yes, sir, I do see that, because what I see now is my book and my play really was about one thing. It was not about business or money. It was about love. I actually wrote a book about this man that turned out to be about love of people. If you want to learn about somebody's life as a journalist, you start off with their parents. And his parents, Mr. Carter's parents, were not so hot. I mean, his mother died, and his father married a wicked stepmother who kicked him out of the house when he was 13. And he had to live as a teenager. He never went past the 8th grade. He moved to Bowie, where he worked as a chambermaid in a hotel. He jumped on the train and he would sell chicken and bread sandwiches for 10 cents to people that stopped in Bowie where the train stopped for water. And just a couple weeks ago, my wife and I, Karen, who's in the back, hi Karen, we went to the Bowie Chicken Heritage Festival, where a century later, they still honor this with a chicken festival. The chicken was really bad, though, so I don't recommend it. But so he had this really rough life. But he, on the other hand, he was brought up in the Depression by a family, mother and father and a sister Betty, who just loved him to death. And he had nothing, but he had everything. His mom and his dad taught him two different things. His dad taught him heads, his mom taught him tails. His dad taught him business. He said, I got my PhD from learning about my father's knee. His father would take him to the auction, and he would teach him. The family motto was not buddies to the end. His father's family motto was sell it, you can't eat it, which meant you buy in the morning and then you sell in the afternoon, or else you have to take it home and feed it. So his daddy started off with bridles and saddles, and then they graduated to ponies and horses. And that's kind of cool. He was about 10 or 11 years old. His father, his name Gabriel, who was an East Texas cotton trader, he would pick him up at school and they go horseback riding every day. And out of all the things I learned about his life, that's the one I'm most jealous of, because I didn't get to spend the time with my dad, going horseback riding. First of all, I lived in Manhattan. But we didn't go for walks, and he didn't teach me about business the way Ross's daddy taught him. He didn't tell me stories about his work like Ross's daddy did. And so, they had this really close relationship. And sell it, you can't eat it. Now, so that was business. Now, the tails of the coin was his mom. His mom was like such a giving, wonderful person that all of the hobos that would jump off the train in the Great Depression would go to the Perot house in Texarkana, knock on the door, and Mrs. Perot, no matter how dirty or scary they were, she would feed them dinner. And one day, one of the hobos said, ma'am, do you know, they called them the Perots in Texarkana. She goes, Miss Perot, do you know why we stop at your house? And she said, I really don't. So he took her out to the curb, and there was this X painted on the curb. And he goes, that's the symbol for, this lady will feed you. So when the man left, Ross said to his mom, he said, Mama, do you want me to wash that off the curb? And she said, no, son, leave it there. These are good people, they're just like us, but they're down in their luck, and we should help them. Every day in elementary school, he had to say the following prayer. Help the man who is down today, give him a lift in his sorrow. Life has a very strange way, no one knows what will happen tomorrow. So his mom taught him philanthropy. And philanthropy in Greece, I looked it up, in Greek, doesn't mean giving out money. It means loving people. So his daddy taught him how to sell, and his mom taught him how to give. Just the other week, the Perot children, all grown, they gave $10 million to the North Texas Food Bank, the Perot campus in Plano. And if you go to the Perot campus and you see this big giant sculpture of an X in front of the front door, that symbolizes that X outside Mrs. Perot's house. So, it never dies, the love of people. So Ross is not a good student. Betty, his sister, the teachers say, why aren't you smart like your sister? But what he is good at is he's a Boy Scout. Any Eagle Scouts here? So congratulations. He got his Eagle Scout badge in 13 months, which is pretty remarkable. And that was the first glimpse that this guy was like a super boy, you know. So he goes to college. He goes to Texarkana Junior College. He's studying pre-law. And the kids, they actually vote him student body president. This guy with these big ears and the squeaky little voice, about 5'6", knows how to win friends and influence people. And so while he's president of the school, he creates an intramural sports program, which is pretty cool for a junior college. And he also teaches the trustees a lesson. He says, you're all about to buy land next door to build. He says, don't do that. Go to the other side of town and build a campus brand new because you'll have a lot more land. And they did. And that's the campus where they are today. And this is the freshman telling these adults how to do things. He's not happy in school, though. He wants to be in the Navy. And the reason he wants to be in the Navy is because there's this really cool guy in Texarkana who's walking around in his Navy uniform. And Ross says, I want to be like him. The problem is, Ross has never been on an airplane. He's never seen a ship. He's never even been to the ocean. He keeps applying every year, and finally, Senator Pappy O'Daniel appoints him to Annapolis. And on his birthday, he flies off to Annapolis, where the same thing happens to him that happened in junior college. He's elected class president. He's also made chairman of the committee to create the Naval Code. They must really like him a lot, because when Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower came and visited in 1948, he was picked to give them the tour. So he's working on the Naval Honor Code, and the admiral's son, whoever that is, gets in trouble. They sweep it under the rug. Ross hears about it, and on principle, he resigns from the committee. He resigns as class president. The head of the Annapolis Academy calls him in and says, Ross, you're behaving just the way we want you to behave, so yeah, please come back. We'll take care of that boy, but come back. So they do. Ross comes back to the committee, and that's the Naval Honor Code that was written in like the late 40s. It's still in effect today, and Ross was one of the authors of it, which is really kind of cool. So he's in the Navy, and he gets on a ship, but it's the Korean War has ended just like a week or two before he got on the ship. So he goes around the world with his shipmates, and he's really upset. Like, he calls the Navy a godless organization. And one of my favorite quotes from him, he says, I don't enjoy the prospect of continuing to stand on the quarterdeck as officer of the deck in foreign ports, being subjected to drunken tales of moral emptiness, passing out penicillin pills, and seeing promiscuity on the part of married men. I constantly hear the Lord's name taken in vain. So that doesn't sound like a straight arrow, just handing out those penicillin pills. We all know what that was for. So he's on the ship console, he's running the ship, he's steering and pushing buttons and doing levers and all this stuff. And there's a guest on board from a company, and he notices this kid, and he says, who's that guy over there? And they go, oh, that's Ross Perot. In the Navy, he became Perot, no more Perot. He says, that's Ross Perot, and he is leaving the Navy in a couple of weeks. So the man walks up to him, and he says, young man, I've been watching you, and I'm wondering if you would like an interview when you leave the Navy with my company, IBM. And Perot says, mister, I'm 26 years old, and I've worked since I was 6, and you are the first person who has ever offered me a job. I always had to look for work, and I don't even know what you do. And the man said, you don't know what IBM does? And Perot said, well, we have IBM typewriters on board. And he says, no, Ross, I'm interested in you because the captain tells me you have a lot of knowledge about the gunfire control computers, and we are in the computer business. So that's how we go back to the start of our story, 1957, where they're in the Plymouth car, and they're driving to Dallas for that job. And he says it's the easiest job in the world because it's the first computers are now out for sale, and they're like the size of old phone booths, and they cost $1 million. And Ross says it's like selling rain umbrellas in a rainstorm. Everybody wants one, but no one knows how to work it. And he's a killer salesman. He's the greatest salesman in the company history. He starts making more money than his bosses. So they redo the salary structure, and he gets really ticked off about it. And the way he protests it is he comes into work with a bathing suit and a towel. And he says, I guess I got nothing to do today, so I'll go swimming. Isn't that kind of that's the way non-hippies protest, And the reason why I think he was so successful was because he was determined. I mean, he would not have coffee in the morning with the boys. He would not meet them for 3 martini lunches, and he would not meet them for happy hour. He sold. When he came home, he whistled. He told his kids he loved them. He grabbed them, said a nighttime prayer, and told them, buddies to the end. He figured, though, that he would try and save his life at the company with 2 brilliant ideas that he had. And he took these 2 ideas to the IBM honchos. And the first one was, look, these people we're selling these computers to, they're not using them from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So why don't we just lease them out overnight and let people use them that can't afford to buy one? And they said, no, we don't want that. We want to sell a computer. He said, all right, as long as we're selling a computer, he said, we have we sell hardware, but we don't sell them software, so they don't really have the industry information in there. They're just blanket computers. So why don't we sell them software? And IBM said, we don't want to do that, paving the way for a guy named Billy Gates to make billions doing that. So he's truly upset now because he has now been rejected with his ideas. He's not making that much money, and there's no more challenges left for him. So he's sitting in his barber shop and looking at that haircut. I guess he probably went and had one every couple of weeks. But on Forest Lane, he was sitting there and he's waiting for his shot. And I remember back those days in the 50s, men didn't read what he read. Men would read Playboy magazine in the barber shop, but he would read Reader's Digest. And this was actually the December 1961 issue of the Reader's Digest that he was reading that day. Not the one, I ordered it off eBay, which is remarkable, but he's reading a story about Henry David Thoreau of Weldon Pond, and this quote jumps out at him. The quote is, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And he says, that's me. He says, if I don't do something different, I'm going to be like that. And he decides to start this company. But he doesn't know what to call it. He goes home and he asks Margot for $1,000, and she gives it to him from her salary teaching at the Green Hill School. And then he goes and he's sitting in church, and I guess the music inspired him, because he pulls out the pledge envelope from the pew in front of him and he writes down this name, Electronic Data Systems, EDS. And that's how one of the greatest companies in the history of this country was formed, just like that, very simply. Remember how I said he didn't know what he wanted to be when he grew up because he hadn't invented it yet? Well, he just invented it. He was now in the computer services industry, and he would go around trying to tell that to people, and they didn't know what it was, so nobody would hire him. He went months and months without being able to get a customer, and then finally he landed one you've all heard of, you probably like, a company called Frito-Lay. And he said, he had this funny quote I love. He says, look, he said, I bill Frito-Lay $5,128 a month for that data processing. And I used odd numbers like 5128 in those days to make it look like I knew exactly what I was doing and had everything figured down to the last penny. And I tell my clients, you have to pay in advance. And when they ask why, I say it's customary in the computer services industry. But the business is so new, there's no customs. I'm making them up as I go along. This was one of the great high-tech technology companies in history. And it didn't do well for the first few years, but then all of a sudden it exploded because in the mid-'60s, you're all looking too young to know about this, but something called Medicare and Medicaid was invented. And they said to the states, you guys got to run this. But the states didn't know how to run it. So Perot started to compete for these contracts. And he would win many, many state contracts, turning it into a multi-million-dollar business. And Morton Meyerson, before he became a symphony center, he was the president of EDS. And he explained it. He said, Ross is a Boy Scout who knows how to street fight. Just as an aside here, Ross in his whole life never owned a computer or a smartphone ever. But when Steve Jobs got fired from Apple the first time, Ross took a 16% interest in Steve's company Next, became his mentor, And Steve Jobs, when he went back to Apple, said, we never would have had an iPhone, an iPad, and an iPod without Ross's support of me. But people just don't remember that. That's like a lost story in computer history. What I like most about the EDS years was the innovation that he had. You know, he bought the land, his second headquarters was at the site of the Forest Hills Country Club in Dallas on 7100 block of Forest Lane. This big building is still there, this monstrosity. And Perot decided to keep most of the amenities from the country club. For example, they had an 18-hole course, and he kept 9 holes, and he hired a golf course superintendent. He kept the pool, he kept the tennis courts, he kept the picnic area, the clubhouse, the fishing pond, the jogging trails, softball fields, and the playground. Now, this is what modern tech companies do today. They offer all these amenities, but nobody did this back there in the early 60s, late 60s the way he did. So very progressive in terms of like keeping people on campus. You know, would walk up to you in the cafeteria and say, hi, I'm Ross Perot. I don't think we've met. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you do here? He knew everybody, you know. But the one area that he wasn't very progressive in was the women and the men, the dress code. I mean, the men had to have short hair like him, had to have white shirts, had to have thin ties, and if you got compliments on your tie, you had to take it off. You had to have polished shoes, no beard, no mustache. But the women really got the raw end of the deal, because the women had to have skirts below the knee, they measured, and if you were wearing pantsuits, you know, they sent you home. So I'm like so close to sending Duff Odell home right now because she's in a pantsuit, but I'll let you stay, okay? So that's so he's doing really well with EDS. He's making a lot of money, and he's recruiting all these Vietnam veterans. You know, he called them Eagles. And so he attracts the attention of a man named Roger Smith. You remember him? He was the CEO of General Motors, the #1 company in America. And Roger decides that he wants to computerize the car business from A to Z, from the design of the car all the way to selling and repairing. And he figures that Perot's company is the only one that can do it. So after a lot of haggling, Ross calls it a merger, Smith calls it a purchase. He buys the company. And so these straight-laced, white shirt, short hair dudes from Dallas go flying up to Detroit to meet the IT guys up there. And they're like freaking out because they hate each other. I mean, there's complete opposites, and nobody told the Detroit boys that the Dallas guys were coming in to take over. And so it gets pretty ugly. In fact, a lot of the Dallas guys, they had their car tires slashed in the GM parking lot. So they decided to send Mort Meyerson to fix it. And he gets up there, and he's at the airport. He calls GM, and he says, I'm here. Can you guys send a car to pick me up? And they said, sorry, we don't have any cars available. So Perot basically makes a promise. He says, I'm going to be your biggest stockholder, and I'm going to have a seat on the board. So when I'm done, he says, Americans are going to be selling cars to Japanese, not the other way around. And so he starts to really dig into the business. And he doesn't like what he sees. Like all the GM executives have an executive dining room up on the top floor. He says, you got to do like me. You got to eat in the cafeteria with your people. He said, we're not doing that. He said, they said, we don't want to sit with the United Auto Workers. They're our enemies, not our friends. So Ross had to like freak out on that. He says, I don't understand why it takes you all 5 years to design a car when we won World War II in 4 years. He says, I don't understand, Roger, why you just closed 11 plants in the U.S. and moved 30,000 jobs to Mexico. I guess that's where Ross got that idea of that giant sucking sound of jobs leaving the country. And he especially hated the fact that because he was a board member, they dropped a new car off at his house every 3 months. He said, I don't want your souped-up board of director perfect car. So on Saturdays, he would put on a baseball hat, sunglasses, and he'd go to a GM dealership, and he'd mystery shop. He'd talk to everybody in there, and he'd buy his own car, which they didn't really like that, you know. So after about a year or two of him just haranguing the company and going public in the press with Business Week and the Wall Street Journal and a lot of business reporters, the GM people are fed up. They can't handle this guy anymore because he's just totally upset them, and it's just nonstop with him, you know, which is the rooster in him. And so they decide that they're going to buy him out. And so Tom Luce, his lawyer, and him, they named this unbelievably high price in $1986 of $750 million. And GM says, sold, here's a check, get out of here. He can't believe it. So he lets it sit in the bank for 3 weeks. He says it's in escrow. He gives them another chance. But they don't want it, and so he gets the money. And now he's not on the board of GM anymore, and he's not on the board of EDS, and for the first time in his life, he doesn't have a job, but he's got all this money. And, you know, I love this story so much because now we're kind of obsessed with CEO pay. CEOs make 1,000 times more what their workers make. Back then, there wasn't such a big issue about the way executives were treated, but he went after that whole cause because that was against the way he lived his life. And it reminds me of the CEO that I used to cover, but I don't anymore because he retired, and that'd be Randall Stevenson of AT&T. I used to write about him, and I interviewed him once. And, he was paid $28 million to run AT&T. Does anybody here think he was worth that? And then when he retired, they pay him $14 million a year just to be a consultant, So Ross wouldn't have put up with that. The one story, I think people don't remember that GM story, but the one story they do remember is the Iran hostage situation. EDS was in Iran in the late 70s, and they were creating a social security system for the entire country. And everybody left from EDS except for these two guys, Paul Gaylord and Bill Ciparone. Bill Gaylord and Paul Ciparone, sorry, I got it confused. And they got caught in there, and they got put in prison. So Ross is on a ski trip in Colorado, gets the phone call. He says it's the worst phone call he's ever gotten in his life. And he flies home, and he recruits 10 of his Vietnam veterans from EDS, who are now guys in their 40s. They've been married, they got kids. And he says, I want you guys to go on a secret corporate commando squad. I mean, who ever heard of that? Corporate commando squad. It doesn't even exist, right? That's so Ross Perot. So he hires a retired special forces guy named Bull Simons, and they go off to the cottage that the Perot owned on Lake Grapevine, which is still there. And they practice. And they fly to Iran, and they're going to get these guys out. Well, in one of the dumbest moves that this man ever probably could have done is he decides to fly to Iran and meet them also. They're out in the streets, the Iranians, with signs that say, death to USA, death to capitalism. And here's a billionaire going right through customs with his passport, doesn't try and change his name or anything because he hadn't run for president yet, so they didn't know who he was. And he goes to the State Department in Tehran, and he goes to the Pentagon people, and all. He can't get anybody to help him. So he goes to the prison. And when Paul and Bill see Mr. Perot walking towards them, they can't believe their eyes. And one of them goes, oh my God, Mr. Perot, if I had known you were coming, I would have shaved. So Ross sits him down. He says, look, I'm here because I'm going to get you out. I don't know, we got guys out there working on this. I don't know if it's going to take like a month, a week, a day, but just be ready because it's coming, okay? And sure enough, it came. They opened up the prison, when the Shah flew in. The Shah flew out to forever, and the Ayatollah flew in from Paris. The rebels on the streets opened up the prison. 2,000 inmates run out in the streets, and our two guys run out there. And they take them in a car to Istanbul. They fly him back to DFW Airport. There's a big sign. 200 EDS employees are there. Welcome home, Bill and Paul. And the next day they have a press conference, and the whole country finds out about this miraculous rescue, which is really cool because just a few months later, 52 American hostages were taken in the Tehran embassy, and you all remember that. We had to live through that for 444 days. And when they tried to rescue them, the helicopters crashed in the desert. But here's Perot pulling it off, So that was when people began to really notice who he was. Then this author named Ken Follett writes a book called On Wings of Eagles, which is a New York Times bestseller. And then NBC creates a 3-part miniseries, which I watched as part of the research for this book. It was terrible. But what cracked me up about it was Ross got to do the casting. And so Burt Lancaster played Colonel Simons. And do you remember tall, dark, handsome Richard Crenna? He played Ross Perot. So his profile now is growing with all these incidents and all these successes. And so now the governor of Texas appoints him to run the drug war in Texas to stop drugs, Nancy Reagan. Well, all I need to say about that is he didn't win that war because you can't. I mean, no one can win the drug war, not even Ross Perot. But he learns how the legislature in Austin works, and he learns how unpretty the whole process is, like making sausage and the power of the lobbyists. So the next governor, Mark White, appoints him to run public education reform. And they create a bill that's 2,000 pages, which is really, I've never really seen another 2,000-page bill, which is still in effect, most of it today. Are there any teachers here? Yeah, you were. And you had to take this awful test that he was so unfair to you about that. He would go around the state criticizing the teachers, saying that they were dumb and stupid, and then he made them in this law take a proficiency test. And almost everyone passed it. But still, I mean, I love my teachers, I would never insult them because I'm only writing books and plays for the newspaper because of my teachers. But, it was a rough time for not only teachers, but he would go from city to city and he would lecture the parents about their kids. He'd say, you have a first-class education here in Texas, but only if you're on the drill team, the band, and the football team. And he said, do y'all want adult entertainment or do you want your kids to learn? He said, a losing football coach is going to get fired or made principal, either one. Right? He said, our children are going to grow up and go to work and they don't know anything. They may have a heck of a time on Friday nights in high school, but for the rest of their lives, they're derelicts. And then he said something that's really true. He said this, 50 years ago. He said, we look smart because God put so much wealth under the ground, but our children are going to grow up in a world of rapid change, and the average person will change career 5 times. For that, he or she needs a fully developed intellect. And that's true because our kids now are changing careers 4 or 5 times. So besides the teacher test, though, they also made seniors take graduation tests, which I think is probably a good thing. They added pre-K for the first time. They limited the elementary school class limits. You know all about that, right? With class size. And then, of course, the worst thing of all was that no pass, no play. Does everybody here know what that is? There's nobody here from Albania or Spain that didn't live through it, right? So, if you got under 70 in one class, you were out of extracurricular for like the next 6 weeks. That was tough. But here we are today, still in effect, and I think things aren't that much better. They're still building $60 million, $100 million football stadiums. But if he hadn't done this, I don't know where the emphasis would be. Just want to talk for a moment about a very sore, hard subject. I don't like even thinking about the Vietnam War. That was a rough time for this country. And, Ross, you probably remember this, he got obsessed with POWs and MIAs. And he would fly over there and he would try and figure out ways to rescue these guys or at least improve their life. And one of the things he did was he rented a Braniff jet and he loaded it with the reporters like me and with the spouses of the POWs and the press and their kids and food and medical supplies and blankets and coats. And he said, let's go. We're going to go to Hanoi. We're going to land in enemy airport. We're going to give this stuff to them and make sure our boys are treated good. But the North Hanoi airport said, no, you're not landing here. Goodbye. So the plane's flying all over the world now, and no one really knows where to land. They're making fun of it, but actually it was a wonderful thing because it turned attention to the POWs. And when a lot of them got out in 73, they said, Mr. Perot, if it wasn't for you, things wouldn't have gotten better. But once you did that, things did get better for us. And he threw them a parade in San Francisco, and he threw them a big gala, and it was a really exciting time. They got John Wayne was at the banquet. And that's how he got interested in giving out millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to post-traumatic stress disorder, which was one of his pet causes after that. But going from Vietnam, I'm going to move to something really fun. I'm going to tell you that, his favorite phrase in life was world class. Everything with him was world class, and he was a world-class practical joker. And he played some great jokes. I want to just tell you about a few of them because they show his level of creativity. He was in a topiary store, and he saw a 12-foot bush cut to resemble a naked woman. And he said to the owner, I need 6 of these. And so one night, he and a friend in a truck came by, picked up 6 of these naked bushes, and he drove around Dallas in the middle of the night, and he'd put them in the lawns of the most high society, falutin, Dallas. I mean, these women are so powerful that they have bridges named after them, okay, right? And so 6 of them wake up, and 3 of them are like have a heart attack and say, get that smut out of my yard. But the other 3 are so thrilled that it's there, and they just think, oh, Ross, that's so great. And in my book, I have a picture of Linda Custard. She has floodlights under hers. She was so proud of it, So his daughter, Suzanne, and her husband, Patrick, they say, Ross, they say, Dad, we're moving back to Dallas. And he says, let me get you a place to stay. And so when they drive up to the address he's given them, there's like an old broken down deer lease trailer with punched in windows and dents and an outhouse. And on the outhouse there's a sign that says, welcome home. So now Patrick doesn't know the rule about not like getting back at his father-in-law, so he's going to get him back anyway. So 3 days before Christmas, he sees an ad in the Dallas Morning News, and it says, camel for sale. And he goes and he buys the camel. And he says, deliver it to the Perot house on Christmas morning. So this truck pulls into the house, and everybody goes, oh, look, someone got us a stuffed camel. And the camel's sitting there like this, and then it goes like this. So Ross goes, wow, a live camel. He said, can I keep him? And Patrick says, Dad, you can keep him forever because I bought him. He's yours. He says, Dad, every wise man needs a camel. And so that camel lives at the Perot house for 2 years, and then they move it to the Circle T Ranch. Did anybody here remember seeing the camel at the Circle T Ranch? We'd see it there. We go, why is there a camel there? And then when the camel died, it's the only camel I know that got an obituary in the newspaper, you know. So when the New York bond lawyers came down to Dallas to meet him to talk about putting EDS on the stock exchange, he decided to do what any North Texan would do, which is to make fun of them. And he tells the New York guys, he says, I got a special lunch treat for you guys. Are you guys hungry? We're going to go to a billionaire's private club. Have you ever been to one? And they go, no, sir. And they go, well, we're going to go there. And they must be imagining they're going to meet J.R. Ewing or something. So they say, come on, get in my car. And he drives them across the street to Dickey's. And they're like, what? Now, the owner of Dickey's is wearing an apron, and it's covered with grease and dirt. He's in on the joke. And he's cutting meat. And they go, you the boys from New York? Okay, I got a special for you. Today's special is barbecued armadillo. And they all take their plates because they don't want to upset their host, but then they're picking at their meat. And then he does that laugh, which it sounded something like, huh, huh. And they go ahead, you can have, that's just beef, I was just funning you. So they go, oh, thanks, Mr. Perot. So when he gets back to New York a few months later to ring the bell of the stock exchange, they say, Mr. Perot, we're taking you out to a special place. It's called the Umbrella Club. Nobody knows about it because it's so exclusive. They take him down to the basement of the parking garage where they hired one of those New York hot dog stands with the umbrellas, you know. So we've been talking about this man for like half an hour, and I haven't even mentioned this once. And the reason I haven't is because I don't think it's the most significant thing he did in his life. Anybody can run for president. We see that when 12 candidates line up for the debates, right? You got to be 35 and you got to be a natural-born citizen, and that's the only qualification. But I remember, does anybody remember watching him on Larry King that night? And Larry says, are you going to run? You going to throw your hat in the ring? And Perot says, only if every state in the country puts me on the ballot, which is an impossibility, because that could never happen, get on the ballot in all 50 states. But it does, because something takes hold of the country in 1992 called Perot mania. And the polls show it. According to the Times CNN poll, Perot is at 38%. George H.W. Bush, the incumbent president, is at 28%, and Arkansas Governor Clinton is at 24%. So Perot is like taking the country by storm. And he's got really good ideas, you know, but they don't know what to make of him because billionaires never run for president before. And so I brought something that shows really how his whole press treatment ended up, you know, how it went down. Because remember, this is a CEO, and he never ever wanted to be asked questions. He didn't like being audited. You know, he refused all audits. And now all these reporters like me are saying, well, what about you leaving the Navy early? What about you selling to GM? What about that buyout from GM? What about this? What about that? And so at first, the headline on Time magazine is waiting for Perot. He's leading in the polls, but can he lead the nation? You know, simple factual question, not unfair. But as things start to get hot for him, Newsweek, Time magazine does something really weird. They put this black border on the cover, which I guess is a symbol of maybe that this Perot candidacy is dying. I can't think of why else they would do a black border like that. And it just says, nobody's perfect, the doubts about Ross Perot. Well, so this is going on now, month after month, the haranguing of him and everything like that. And then through, you know, you've heard the story about how he wanted to protect his daughters, that they were going to be messed with by the dirty tricksters. And he, you know, family first. This is a story about love. He quits. No one sees it coming. He doesn't bother to tell his staff. He doesn't tell his family. Just one day he just says, I'm out of the race, and that's it. Which turned out to be a brilliant move, because in early October he jumps back in again. No one really expected that. And he jumps back in. Time magazine says he's back. I don't know if you can see that in the back, but they have a little Ross Perot just coming, sticking his head up on the top. Can you see that in the back? So what happens now, they put him in 3 debates. There's 3 debates in October, and they let him in every single one of them. And he kills it in the first one. I watched it. He won that debate. Everybody said he won that first debate. And it was because people really liked his sexy, funny, wonderful, humorous. You know, there was sort of sex appeal to a guy who like speaks from the heart, doesn't beat around the bush, has a sense of humor. And I think Americans really did fall in love with that personality of his, that East Texas humor. They just loved him. Now, I like the way he brought some issues out also. I like the way he talked about the national deficit, the debt, the national debt. It was about $2 trillion back then. Now, last week they announced that it's $30 trillion. But the way he would explain it, he'd say, look, people, $1 billion in $1,000 bills is 4 inches high. Excuse me, $1 million in 1,000 bills is 4 inches high. $1 billion is 300 feet high, and $1 trillion extends 63 miles into space. So imagine that now that trillion is going all the way to Pluto, you know. But he only gets, because he dropped out, he lost a lot of votes. I remember voting for him. He got 19% of the vote, which is phenomenal. 1 out of 5 voters voted for him. Think what would have happened if he hadn't dropped out. You know, he had the Reform Party. The only other presidential candidate who had ever done that well in a third party was his hero, 1912, Teddy Roosevelt. He loved Teddy Roosevelt so much I forgot to tell you that his camel was named Teddy, you know. So the reason why I don't think that was really his main achievement was because it's the angelic side of him, the philanthropist side of him, that really matters the most. He turns out to be probably the most giving man that maybe ever existed in this country. I mean, it was like thousands of people that he would help. If you worked at EDS and your brother's friend's cousin got sick, he'd take an interest in it, and he'd fly you up in a jet to the Mayo Clinic. He'd put you in UT Southwestern, but he wouldn't just put you in a room. He'd get you in the suite, and then he'd come by, and he'd ask the nurse how you were doing. He'd talk to the doctor about you, because the thing about him, he didn't invest in programs, or budgets, or salaries. He invested in people, and it's just impossible to see how many people that he helped, because it was just literally off the books, and that's what made him special. You know, when Morton Meyerson said, "Can I have $10 million for the Symphony Center?" Perot said, "Yeah, but your name's not on it. Your name's on it, not mine." And Meyerson said, "I'm from Fort Worth. I don't want any attention." And he said, "So, man, if I'm given the money, I get to pick the name. Welcome to the Morton Meyerson Symphony Center." Same thing happened in Leavenworth. They were building the Interagency for Cooperation among government branches, and they said, "We want to name it after you." He said, "No, I want you to name it after Bull Simons, because he's the one that led my raid in Iran." Oh, God, we've got the museum, right? And it just goes on and on. We've got Mrs. Perot has that health center. Ross said one day, he explained it. He says, "Look, it all starts with a telephone call. I'm just sitting here doing business when someone calls with a problem. I like what I hear, and I say, hey, we got to saddle up and do this." Junior said, "Every day my father comes to work to figure out how he can help somebody." It's just like me, the watchdog at the newspaper. Every day I go to work figuring out how I can help somebody, except I don't have access to $8 billion. But other than that, you know. I want to talk a little bit about Margot. Whenever I give this talk in Dallas, women come up to me after and tell me they were just with Margot yesterday. Margot's their best friend. They sat with Margot in church. Margot is probably the single most popular person in Dallas. A couple of years ago, she got the LINZ Award, L-A-N-Z, which they give out to the top volunteer. The way they met was really kind of charming. It was a blind date. He was in the Navy, she was in college in Baltimore, and she didn't want to go out on a blind date, and her roommates begged her, "Oh, come on, he's really different, he's cool, you're going to like him, he's a Texan." And she says, "I don't want to go out with a Texan, I don't want to go out with a guy with rope and boots and spurs." And they go, "Look, Margot, if you don't really like him, you can leave early." And she says, "Okay." So she goes there, and she kind of falls in love right away with his sense of humor. She tells Ken Follett later. And when she gets back, she pictures herself living on a Texas ranch. And her roomies say, "So how did it go, Margot?" And they go, "Well, you know, he was clean." This is like one of the famous stories in the family. What did she mean by that? And she says, no, I don't mean clean, I mean clean cut. He had short hair, Navy uniform, he looked really good with his polished shoes and everything like that. So, you know, he had 5 kids. Ross Jr. was one, and then Nancy was his oldest daughter. And Nancy runs Interrobang Books, which is really the best bookstore in Dallas. And when that bookstore was destroyed in the tornado, she said to herself, "What would my dad do?" And she realized her dad would have done what she ended up doing, which is kept all the employees on full salary and rebuild the bookstore as fast as they can in a place that's even better. I really haven't had a chance to talk about Junior, but the money that Senior obviously started to make was plowed into Alliance to get it going. And, you know, calling Junior a mega developer is too small, because he's got Alliance Texas, but he's got Alliance, California, he's got Alliance, Florida. I even saw there's an Alliance in Poland. And, the Facebook building alone there is like a mile long. I've never seen a building that big. It's just incredible. And that's really why Fort Worth is the 12th largest city in the country right now. It's because this man, Amy Carter, started that trend to bring companies in, and then the Perots, took it to an art form, flying over in the helicopter and taking CEOs around. The amount of tax dollars is just in the billions of dollars, too. 27,000 acres right now. I live right next door to it, so I keep my eye on it. Recently, Junior, who's really more like his dad, decided to donate a helicopter to the Dallas Police Department. So he flew it in very dramatically. Him and Sarah, his wife, get out of the helicopter and they landed at the Dallas Police Station and they say, "Here are the keys," just like that. And recently they just renamed Alliance Airport. Does anybody know what the new name of it is? Does anybody want to guess? Perot Airfield / Alliance Airport. So, the 12th largest city. So, in my play, which ran 9 times at Capel, thanks for mentioning that, Duff, he has died, but he doesn't know it. And he walks out on stage, and there's all these people there, and he figures he must be campaigning for president. So he starts campaigning, and then this angel comes and she starts to talk to him about his life. And he doesn't really know what's going on, but at the end of the play he says, "Well, it's time to go. Margot's waiting for me for dinner." She says, "Ross, you're not going home. You're going forward." And I'm not giving away the real ending of the play, except to say, he did not go to hell. Hey, it was an easy thing for them to figure out where to send him to, So my book is really not just about his life. I call it my journey in search of Texas-style family because, frankly, and I'll say this to you, I don't say this to audiences outside of Northeast Tarrant County, but I was really upset with the family because I didn't like what they did in the late 90s when they demolished the town of Westlake. I covered, some of you might not remember that, but I covered it for the newspaper. So I really wasn't very happy with the way the family did things. But then I saw that that was an aberration for Junior to do that, what he did there, and I began to see them in a whole different light. So I had to overcome my feelings about them to really be able to see them with an open mind. And that's what makes this book so interesting. It's a memoir about what it's like to cover billionaires when they don't want to be covered. There's all kinds of things in there, private detectives, and one time I gave a speech and there was a private detective and he was recording it in the woods with a microphone, and by the time I got back to the newspaper, my boss knew everything I had said. I said, "Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff, The first reviewer that wrote the book about the book, he said, "Lieber calls the book Searching for Perot, and our conclusion is he found him." I wanted people to understand his patriotism because I think we're having a loss of patriotism in our country, and also innovation, and also his community service because, as he would say, it's just that simple. It's just that simple. So when people ask me, I'm going to wrap this up, and if you have any questions or comments, I'm all ears. You say that right, I'm all ears. People say, "Well, why'd you do this? Why'd you do this project?" I mean, I worked for the paper for him, so that was it. But what about that? Especially since you weren't the biggest fans when you started out. And it's pretty simple. I watched the funeral on rossperot.com. And when Junior got up at the church and gave the eulogy, I started to cry. I never heard a eulogy that beautiful, that well written, that touching in my life. So I decided to reverse engineer it and find out how we got from that point all the way back to the beginning. And remember when I said love? This right here is really what love looks like. This is what love looks like if you could see it. So Ross Perot Jr. stands and he says, "Dad never wanted to slow down. But in February of this year, our family knew we only had months to go. The Lord gave us another 5 months with Dad. And during that time, he was still going to the office on weekdays and the lake each weekend. He was surrounded by his family, friends, and wonderful caregivers. And Mom and Dad would spend their nights holding hands and watching classic movies, and Dad still wanted to dance with Mom. Our last trip to the lake was 3 Saturdays ago. I arrived 5 minutes late, and Dad gave me the look. And on the way out, Dad insisted he stop and give Mom a kiss. At the lake, we sat together holding hands, looking at the water. We did not say much. We did not have to. We had said all we could to each other. He sat in his father's rocking chair. We looked at photos of his mom and dad, and my father have ultimately passed away in peace, surrounded by his family, holding my mother's hand. Condolences have come in from around the world as my father touched the lives of millions. My father had courage, character, integrity, legendary qualities, a true patriot. My father will be missed, but never forgotten. Ross Perot did his duty to God, his country, his family, his friends. He helped other people at all times. His legacy will live through all he touched. Thank you, God, for this wonderful man. Buddies, to the end. Thank you. I brought a little flip chart with me. I can't do Ross Perot without one of these little charts, right? So these are all the people in the Grapevine Historical Society, and this little bar here of yellow represents all of you that are not afraid of the rain. So.